From the Great Depression to the Great Recession, it's a decade since the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Has the world learned from its mistakes, or is history destined to repeat itself? I'm Imran Garda, and today's Newsmaker is the global financial crash 10 years on. Few thought it would happen. They said Lehman Brothers was too big to fail. But in 2008, the investment bank filed for bankruptcy, the largest in U.S. history. And as Lehman fell, the world's economy began to fall with it, unleashing a financial crisis not seen since the Great Depression. Thousands lost their homes, even more lost their jobs, leaving the economy in tatters. So, who was to blame? Most of the world said it was the banks themselves. But that was a decade ago. Since then, new regulations have been put in place to keep the banks in check. But are they enough to prevent another crash? We'll discuss that in a moment. But first, Haider Abbasi has this report.
Too big to fail? The US government didn't think so. 10 years ago, it allowed one of America's biggest investment banks to collapse. And it triggered a crisis, not just in the United States, but across the world. The Lehman Brothers bankruptcy eventually led to a global recession, which is still being felt today. Millions of homes and jobs were lost. And analysts say the rise of populist politics has its roots in the financial crisis of 2008. But how did Lehman collapse? And why did it cause a worldwide recession? It all began with something called the subprime mortgage. A decade ago, cheap credit was widely available. And US banks were handing out home loans to people who couldn't repay them. These mortgages were bundled up and sold to banks like Lehman. So when millions of homeowners began to default on their mortgages, investors suffered huge losses. Banks stopped lending to each other, and eventually, all that credit disappeared. And a modern economy simply can't function without access to credit. The collapse in the subprime market affected banks across the world. What followed was a decade of austerity, as governments around the globe raised taxes and cut spending. Despite the reckless behavior of the bankers, none of them were held to account. Instead, governments helped to bail out the banks using taxpayer money. So 10 years later, is there a risk of another financial crisis? Restrictions have been put on banks, but critics argue they didn't go far enough. Gordon Brown, who was Prime Minister of Britain in 2008, says another crisis is inevitable.
And I feel we're sleepwalking into the next crisis. I feel that this is a leaderless world. And I think when the next crisis comes, and there will be a future crisis, we'll find that we neither have the fiscal and monetary room for manoeuvre that we had in 2008-9, or the willingness to take that action.
Brown says most of the issues that caused the collapse 10 years ago remain unresolved. He says the bankers that caused the crisis should have been punished as a deterrence. According to the Institute of International Finance, global debt has reached a record $237 trillion. That's 70 trillion more than it was a decade earlier. And regulations on the banking sector have been relaxed. In May, US President Donald Trump reversed parts of the Dodd-Frank Banking Reform Act. He said it would help banks grow, but critics argue it will encourage the reckless behavior of 2008. Trump has also been criticized for starting trade wars and isolating the United States from the rest of the world. Analysts warn that if there is another crash, it will be much harder to resolve due to a lack of cooperation between nations. So is the world ignoring signs of a new financial crisis, and what can be done to prevent it? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New Jersey is Thomas Russo. He was the Vice Chairman and General Counsel at Lehman Brothers. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, we have Michael Barr. He was the Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions under the Obama administration. And in Baltimore, we have Lawrence Ball, who's the author of The Fed and Lehman Brothers Setting the Record Straight. Gentlemen, good to have you on The Newsmakers. Michael Barr, let me begin with you. 10 years ago, was it the correct decision to allow Lehman to die?
I think it's very hard to judge after the fact the particular decisions that policymakers made at the time. I was not in the government in the fall of 2008 when Lehman failed. My understanding from what the policymakers said at the time was they did not believe that there was anything the Fed could do that would be effective given the huge capital hole and the bleeding of clients away from Lehman Brothers at that moment. And, more broadly, I think the basic problem was the government was put in a horrific position that fall where even the basic choices were too constrained. There's basic choice of putting Lehman into bankruptcy or potentially providing indefinite lending from the Fed. And I think neither of those would have been especially attractive. And that's one of the reasons for the need for deep financial reform in the wake of the crisis to try and avoid that in the future.
Yeah. Thomas Russo, did you feel aggrieved that others were bailed out, but you guys were allowed to fail?
Yeah, I thought it was a bit arbitrary. They saved Bear Stearns, and then they saved Freddie and Fannie before Lehman, and then I think there was some expectation that the central bank would be there. And then, of course, 2 days later, they saved AIG, and then that following weekend, they made bank holding companies out of Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, and they basically turned the spigots on for all banks and investment banks. And they let Lehman go, and their excuse, or I should say their reason, was that there was a lack of sufficient collateral. And I think over time, when this has been actually looked at, there was more than sufficient collateral, and there isn't one shred of evidence, as far as I know, that they actually made the decision based upon a lack of power. I think they made the decision as a political decision,
right?
Because of the mood in the country.
Okay, so Lawrence Ball, was it arbitrary? So you have this massive earthquake, nobody expects it financially. Was it just a sort of coin toss? We'll save this one and let that one collapse?
Well, I essentially agree with Mr. Russo's point of view that it was arbitrary, or there was no reason to let Lehman go while saving the others. As Professor Barr said, the policymakers of the time have insisted that there was nothing in their power that they could do legally to rescue Lehman, but that is simply not true. The policymakers had never actually backed that up with any evidence, and if one looks at Lehman's finances, as Mr. Russo said, Lehman had plenty of collateral to borrow the money it needed to keep in operation for some time, maybe to survive in the long run, maybe to have been wound down, but certainly some resolution of the problem could have been found that was less disastrous for the financial system than just telling Lehman you have 6 hours to file a bankruptcy petition for the largest bankruptcy in history.
Michael Barr, so looking at where we are now in 2018, what happened in 2008, at the heart of it, you had, I guess, greedy banks lending money to people they knew would not be able to pay back those loans. Those loans are a little bit murky. They get repackaged into weird things that very few people understand, credit default swaps and so on and so forth, and you have these ripple effects. That's happening today in 2018. Does the fact that that's still happening in 2018 mean that nobody's learned the lessons of 2008 and that this might happen again?
Well, I think there's always a significant risk that you put in place the kinds of conditions that will lead to the next financial crisis. I think that the financial sector is much stronger today than it was 10 years ago because of the reforms that were put in place in the wake of the crisis in the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States and globally through the Financial Stability Board and in other countries. So there's more capital in the system now. There's more oversight of derivatives markets than there was before. There's an ability to wind down large firms like Lehman Brothers or AIG through the Orderly Liquidation Authority if they get into trouble. So there are a set of reforms that are making the system safer than they were before. But we're already at risk of forgetting all of that.
Right.
I think if you look at what's going on in the United States, there's a significant sense that we're going to see deregulation under this administration, a rolling back of the reforms, and I think that is extremely dangerous.
Yeah. Professor Barr, tell me a little bit about trust. When, for example, back then, Ben Bernanke said, well, subprime won't be too much of a problem, right? So when somebody watching this program hears you going, well, we're in stronger shape right now, is it harder for you to actually get people to trust your analysis that the system is pretty strong, given that in the past, people just couldn't see this thing coming?
Well, I think that people should be appropriately skeptical about the strength of the financial system. And I think one of the risks that I see is that people are becoming too complacent, not too willing to reduce the capital standards that were put in place, too willing to relax reforms in the consumer market. So I think it's healthy for the public to be skeptical of the strength of the financial system and to insist on continued reforms to make the system safer.
Right. Thomas Russo, I've got some figures about the Lehman Brothers CEO, Richard Fuld. Between 2000 and 2007, in terms of a combination of shares sold and bonuses, he made $522 million. This is according to a Harvard study. So when we look at that, even though you feel, okay, you guys shouldn't have been allowed to crash and others were saved, at the heart of it all, you have taxpayers within the United States and ordinary citizens around the world who feel that greedy bankers made all this money, screwed things up, still got a healthy paycheck, and they had to suffer and they had to fit the bill. 10 years on, do you accept that that was perhaps the reality?
No, I don't, because the figures that you gave are terribly misleading. And I'll just give you an example. The way I'll take the Lehman case and you could take Dick, or you could take, frankly, my own compensation. The vast majority of compensation was in stock, vast majority, maybe 80% in some cases. And that stock didn't become yours at Lehman until 5 years after you've earned it. So essentially you're working, you got to wait 5 years. So at the time of the bankruptcy, the vast majority of your compensation was worth zero. So that the numbers that you take from the comp tables, those are the numbers based upon when you earn them. But what you actually get and pay taxes on is what you get at Lehman, at least 5 years, which is much longer than most. So that if it was that people were incentivized to do anything because of the compensation, I thought it was quite the opposite, because you had the vast majority of what you made over 5 years that ultimately was worth zero at Lehman. Now, of course, all the other companies that were saved, you had slightly different story. But even at AIG, the vast majority of the stock went down. I don't know the percentage.
Okay. All right. So, Lawrence Ball, has this been overblown? The fact that these CEOs and others and bankers get bonuses, they made millions, but ordinary people lost their jobs, lost their homes, had to pay more taxes in order to save companies. Was that overblown 10 years ago?
Well, it's certainly horrible that so many people lost their jobs and there was such a big recession. That's not overblown. It is not really true that the taxpayers paid money for the so-called bailouts. There are misconceptions about that. The Federal Reserve lent money to banks, but that money was paid back with interest. They could have lent a Lehman rescue would have involved lending money to Lehman that almost certainly would have been paid back. So there were not any direct costs to taxpayers in the sense of giving money to bankers. There were terrible costs of the fact that Lehman was allowed to fail, and there was a big recession and millions of people around the world lost their jobs.
Michael Barr, if you'll allow me to wade into political territory, there are those who make connections between the populism that we've seen over the past few years whether it's with regards the election of Donald Trump into office, Brexit, populist movements, and a new kind of spiky nationalism in Europe. They make that connection between the global financial crash in 2008 and all of this that came afterwards. And of course, they are historical parallels. They say Great Depression, fascism comes afterwards. Is that accurate?
Well, I think that there are a broad range of factors that have led to the rise of populism in the United States and around the world in the last really 30 years. If you look at basic problems in the stagnation of wages for middle-income families, if you look at the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia around the world, these factors are important. I do think that the financial crisis and the economic devastation that it caused was a further accelerant to what was already a rather troubling trend. So I think it played a role, but it was not the only thing driving what is a significant increase in nationalism, xenophobia, anti-immigrant feelings, and a move towards authoritarianism that I think is quite disturbing globally.
Okay, so all of those moves towards nationalism, xenophobia, and so on, Lawrence Ball, have they been ripples of the cataclysmic events of 2008? People look at a country like Greece, for example. Was that a ripple of the financial crisis?
Well, as Professor Barr says, there are lots of political factors. I certainly think that the economic problems in Europe were affected very, very strongly by the financial crisis in the U.S. The financial crisis in the U.S. and recession in the U.S. led to recessions in Europe, and that greatly exacerbated the debt problems in Greece and elsewhere. So certainly the U.S. financial crisis spilled over into a lot of economic hardship and suffering in Europe. I am not a political expert, but common sense suggests that if people are losing their jobs and in great economic distress, they will be angry, and that if millions and millions of people are angry, that will be a significant boost to essentially misplaced anger will be expressed in places like Brexit and the U.S. presidential election and other sorts of populism.
And Thomas Russo, for those who look at what's happening right now around the world, and they see that subprime mortgages are back, when they see an emerging market currency crisis in places like Argentina, places like here in Turkey, when they see some of the echoes of 2008 and they see some similarities and they're worried that there's going to be another big crash, do you concur with them that we're on the verge of something big?
Well, I don't know if I'd say it's the verge of something big. I think one of the issues that I see is that if we talk about things in terms of 2008, we may be stuck with solutions of problems that occurred in 2008. And I'm not convinced that that's going to be the main source of any problems. I mean, if the emphasis is the banks should have more regulation, et cetera, that's not looking at life holistically. You have to look at the consumer, you have to look at rating agencies, but you also have to look at more what I would call financial infrastructure issues, such as Social Security, Medicare, pensions, and if the main cause of the problem in 2008 was a leverage by everybody, by the consumer, by everybody, if that was it, and you look at it today, you could make a very strong argument that the leverage that is there with the unfunded liabilities, particularly in the pension system and the Medicare system, that could be a cause. And unlike what happened in 2008, where you had the Fed doing what it did and a lot of fiscal stimulus, at some point with the deficits the way they are, you could have a problem at the federal and state level, and there is no governmental body above that to do anything. So that to me is a much more holistic way of looking at the problems, and we don't seem to be able to solve those because that takes a political determination, and politicians live very much in the short run and getting elected.
Right, Michael Barr, as you mentioned, Michael Barr, earlier on, the political determination from the Trump administration seems to be less regulation. So where's that balance right now? Where's the balance of power? Is it with the free markets, which might lead to more trouble because with less regulation means less oversight, means people can get away with more?
Yes, I'm quite worried about that. I mean, I think that there's a kind of collective amnesia that has descended on Washington about the causes and consequences of the financial crisis that were so devastating to American households and businesses. And there does seem to be this move to try and roll back the reforms that were essential to making the system safer. And as I said before, we not only need to keep those in place, but we need to further strengthen the system and look out for new risks where they arise, inside and outside the banking system, in derivatives markets, in high-frequency trading, in money market funds where the reforms were not fully put into place, in rating agencies, in securitization. So there's risk that is throughout the financial system, and if we're not on top of them, if we get complacent about risks in the system, we're going to recreate the conditions that led to the last financial crisis.
Okay, Lawrence Ball, tasty headline that came out very recently, a couple days ago. Experts at investment bank JP Morgan saying the next global financial crisis will begin in 2020. Doomsday scaremongering or something we should take seriously?
My goodness, if they actually know what year the next crisis is going to be in, they have a crystal ball. I can't imagine how they come up with 2020. I think the history of finance teaches us that there are periodically crises. I mean, the nature of financial markets and capitalism is that risks are taken, and sometimes regulations are effective, sometimes they're not, but accidents will happen. And as Professor Barr pointed out, the risk of accidents is going up, probably because of regulations, because of the deregulatory environment politically now. But I think it's very hard to say when there's going to be a crisis. I mean, a few years before the last crisis, subprime mortgages were a new thing. Nobody dreamed that they would be something that would bring down the whole world economy. So we don't know when the next crisis will be, but it will happen one of these days, and it will probably be for some reason that nobody anticipated beforehand.
Yeah, a strong case for humility, especially since what happened 10 years ago just blindsided everybody. I can't believe it's been 10 years, but gentlemen, it's been fascinating picking your brains. We covered a lot of ground. Thomas Russo, Michael Barr, and Lawrence Ball. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, US-backed forces attack Daesh's last stronghold in Syria. Is this the end of the terror group as we know it? And why is the UAE offering a visa amnesty to its illegal residents? From Syria and Iraq to Afghanistan and Europe, Daesh has reigned terror all over the world. But bit by bit, its so-called caliphate has been dismantled. Now the last trace of land the group holds in Syria could be about to fall. A US-backed coalition has begun an operation against Daesh in Hajin, the very region the group was born. So, is it time to celebrate the demise of Daesh, or will its violent ideology live on? Randolph Nogel reports.
After more than 4 years and 29,000 airstrikes, the American-led coalition against Daesh says it's on the brink of taking back the group's few remaining pockets of territory in Syria. The US-backed alliance of fighters, known as the SDF, or Syrian Democratic Forces, are on the front lines, making what they hope will be the final push. Daesh still has a few pockets of control or influence in both Iraq and Syria, straddling the two countries' border. The SDF's recent attacks have targeted the Daesh-controlled town of Hajin on the east bank of the Euphrates River. But Daesh has grown into a transnational terror group since it captured large parts of Iraq and Syria in 2014. Now it has lost all but 1% of that territory, but it continues to grow in outposts in Asia and Africa. And it has taken responsibility for many attacks in Europe, raising the question of whether Daesh is shrinking or simply dispersing. The group has tracts of territory in Afghanistan, between Kabul and Kandahar, as well as on the Afghan-Pakistan border. Its Afghan affiliate, known as the Islamic State in Khorasan, has carried out high-profile attacks that have killed hundreds of civilians. And its once heavy presence in Libya has been considerably reduced. But across Africa, Daesh has managed to make alliances with groups like Boko Haram.
Si on exclut l'Irak, la Syrie et l'Afghanistan,
in terms of attacks, if we exclude Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, the highest number of terrorist attacks are in the African continent.
And in the Philippines too, Daesh has tried to exploit a decades-long insurgency against the government. The group has called for foreign fighters to travel to the Philippines in an effort to establish a foothold in the region. Daesh territory has been drastically reduced in Iraq and Syria, but it's unclear if its influence around the globe is dwindling or is taking root in the most underdeveloped corners of the world. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Mark Kimmitt. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. And in Doha is Martin Reardon. He's a Senior Vice President of the Sufan Group, a security consultancy, and a former member of the FBI. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. General Kimmitt, let me begin with you. Do you agree with Colonel Sean Ryan, who says we expect a long and hard fight against Daesh? These are the die-hard fighters with nowhere else to go. Is it going to get ugly?
Well, I don't think it's going to get particularly ugly because to a great extent, Daesh has transformed itself from being a large military organization resident inside of a caliphate into a much smaller groups, large numbers of those groups, but smaller groups that are no longer fighting militarily, but as terrorists again.
General Kimmitt, when we look at it, there are still some estimates that say they still have between 20 to 30,000 fighters. Isn't it then theoretically and practically more difficult to fight between 20 to 30,000 people who are spread disparately rather than the past when they were all sort of in the same place?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It's one, more difficult simply because they're dispersed to so many different locations that are types of intelligence systems that we have, overhead imagery, intelligence collection services, are not as, they don't present as large of a target. Second, they're also fighting differently. They're no longer going to be fighting as squads and platoons, but they're going to be fighting as terrorists, and in fact avoiding fighting and going back to their old practices of using IED, suicide bombers, and selected assassinations. So yes, it will be more difficult.
Martin Reardon, for those who look at the situation in Hajin and its surroundings and see it as some sort of final showdown and grand finale, that if Daesh is defeated there, they're gone, they're done and dusted, it's finished, are they prematurely celebrating here? Should we be more cautious?
I think so. I mean, in Hajin, I think it's expected that they'll be defeated there. And once that happens, the caliphate, as far as territory, will no longer exist. But as the general mentioned, ISIS is still a formidable force, a terrorist organization. They're basically changing. They're going from, expanding and remaining in place to adapting and evolving. They're changing back into a counterinsurgency, back into a terrorist organization, which is how they started out in 2004. Remember, ISIS isn't new. They go back under a number of different names since 2004. And at one point, they were pushed back underground and weren't really a threat. But they came back with a vengeance in 2011, then again in 2014 when they stormed back into Mosul. So ISIS is very much a threat, a terrorist threat, not only in Iraq and Syria, but in ungoverned space throughout the world, in North Africa, in the Sahel, in East Africa, in Asia. They're active in Asia. And of course, as a terrorist organization, they're very much a threat in Russia, in Europe, potentially in North America, and
right.
the rest of the world.
Yeah, okay. So in a few moments, I'm going to try and look at some of those hotspots and see how it might differ tactically and otherwise in trying to defeat them there. But let me focus on Iraq and Syria for the moment, General Kimmitt. How did you get it right, I guess? It's been a bunch of years, and sometimes we don't often give credit where it's due when a terribly horrible, horrendous organization is on its knees and on the verge of being defeated. It took a lot of troops, a lot of different countries' armies, a lot of airstrikes, thousands of airstrikes to get to where we are now. What was, I guess, at the core of the strategy that allowed these countries and the coalition to get to this point of nearly being at victory?
Well, I think in many ways it was the mistake that they made, the strategic mistake that ISIS made that caused them to differ with Zawahiri and core al-Qaeda. If you remember, core al-Qaeda said it is not yet time to establish the caliphate. The caliphate is not ready. The ground is not set. The area is not yet fertile for you to establish the caliphate. They said that if you do, it will be destroyed, because when you become a caliphate and you become a military organization and you're fighting the coalition of 60 nations with far better technology, far better capability, and quite frankly, far more experience at fighting semi-conventional wars, it was inevitable that they were going to be defeated as a military organization inside of a caliphate. That's playing to our strength. Zawahiri was smart enough to recognize that. So what are they doing? They're going from ISIS 2.0 back to ISIS 1.0, which has been so successful for them, back to the days of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in 2003 and 2004.
And that will cook up its own set of challenges. Martin Reardon, was it a mistake? Do you agree with General Kimmitt that they should not have, if you were tactically advising them, they should not have actually established the caliphate and centered themselves in places like Mosul and Raqqa because it made it easier to defeat them?
Yes, I mean, I agree with the general. That split with Zawahiri was a tactical blunder. Keeping in mind, the ideology of al-Qaeda and the ideology of the Islamic State really don't differ. They want the same three things. They want to diminish the Western influence in Muslim countries. They want to overthrow the corrupt or apostate regimes in those Muslim countries, which, as far as ISIS is concerned, is every Muslim government is corrupt except their own. And then eventually the establishment of a caliphate. And as the general said, al-Qaeda was taking the long game on this. This is something that will happen, but it could be a few generations down the road. Al-Baghdadi went too fast. He established a caliphate, and basically he had the world going against him. And as the general said, he was in no position to take on a conventional war against NATO, against the United States, against the Arab coalition that went up against him.
And Martin, as we broaden this out,
and the new modern, the new Iraqi military.
Right, of course. And as we broaden this out and we look at the franchises around the world, some of those that you mentioned, in Afghanistan, in the Sahel, and in other places, what worries you the most? The Sinai, even. I mean, we're seeing them, with multiple atrocities in multiple places over the past couple of years, so they're not dead yet. When you look at where they are, what worries you particularly?
The fact that there's really no end in sight. Whether it's the Islamic State, al-Qaeda, any terrorist organization, they thrive in ungoverned space. And that's what you have in these countries that you've mentioned, ungoverned space, where the local population have a lot of grievances, some legitimate, maybe not, others not so legitimate. But as long as they have that governed space, they'll go in and they'll thrive, and they'll continue to recruit young people. Keep in mind, Islamic State, they've got a few things going for them. They've got a war chest that, by some estimates, could exceed $400 million outside of Iraq and Syria. they've got a propaganda machine that is just, it resonates worldwide with people that follow that ideology. And again, there's not going to be a shortage of future foreign fighters or future fighters as long as you have these grievances in certain locales within the world.
Mark Kimmett, where's the new center of tension? What worries you?
Well, what worries me is not a location, but it's time. Look, these are the same points we were making back in 2003, 2004. 2005, CENTCOM released the study of the long war, and everything that Martin has said then, we were saying back in 2003, 2004. These organizations find sanctuary and safe haven in ungoverned spaces. This is a generational problem. This is an ideological problem. They are going to find these ungoverned spaces because that's their best area to train and to prosper. And what worries me is that it has been almost 15 years now since we were saying this at CENTCOM, and there has not been any appreciable ability to push back on this. It is like whack-a-mole. If it gets destroyed in Iraq and Syria or diminished in Iraq and Syria, it can go to Mali, it can go to the Sinai, it can go down to Oman, it can go down into Yemen. It has the ability to propagate anywhere around the world, and even though we've been able to stamp it out or significantly mitigate its capabilities in one area, it continues to crop in other areas. So after 15 years, we haven't seen the progress.
Right, and talking about mitigating their capabilities, the U.S. dropped the mother of all bombs on the group, purportedly, about a year and a half ago. That hasn't quite stemmed the flow of growth of Daesh in Afghanistan. So with that in mind, is just dropping bombs on them, really the solution?
Well, it certainly isn't, and I think we can't take the dropping of the mother of all bombs as idiomatic of how we're fighting this war. In fact, what has been happening over the last 15 years is a growing capability, particularly among our high-end special operations forces, to reach out, to find them, and to destroy them, but not with bombs, but with good intelligence, primarily good intelligence, and then the use of local forces to either apprehend them or kill them. That's going to be the success going forward. It's not going to be by dropping bombs. It's going to be by good intelligence, good local forces going up against them.
Martin, how agile are they? And are they capable of taking direction from, I don't know, Baghdadi or the center of power, or does that not matter at all? If an attack is going to take place, do they have to get the order from whoever, or can you just do it and afterwards, I don't know, claim your brothers will claim credit?
Well, I think if you look at the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, both, they went from, well, Al-Qaeda from a very centralized organization to a decentralized organization out of necessity in 2002, 2003. They had to, that's when the affiliates for Al-Qaeda came on, and Islamic State initially was an affiliate. It was the biggest affiliate for Al-Qaeda when they were Al-Qaeda in Iraq and a number of other names. So they don't need to have that central direction. And I think what you've seen, a lot of the attacks, there are people who are inspired by the ideology, and they claim either Islamic State or they claim Al-Qaeda. But they're inspired by that ideology. They're not taking direction. You have some of these attacks where there was direction, whether it came from al-Baghdadi or it came from one of the other affiliates in North Africa or elsewhere in the world. But they do get some direction. But they're very capable, as is Al-Qaeda, of operating independently. Individuals or very small, unaligned cells.
Right. And General Kimmett, the Trump administration's approach to this in the Middle East in general over the past couple of years has been ISIS first or Daesh first, even within the fog of the Syrian war, ultimately even the support of the SDF and YPG affiliates connected to the PKK was always about they're helping us defeat Daesh, that's why we support them, that's why we arm them, and that has ebbed and flowed over the past few months, and it's been an interesting relationship with Turkey, to say the least. Is that still the right approach? having Daesh, a Daesh first approach, eliminate them first and then everybody else?
Well, candidly, it's our only authorized approach. Right now, the U.S. Congress has accepted the fact that U.S. forces and the coalition are operating inside of Syria for the specific purpose of defeating Daesh. They have no other authority to either go against the regime or to push back on the Iranian and Russian influence inside of Syria. So as I've said before, this isn't a matter of aspirations, it's a matter of authorizations, and that's all they're authorized to do inside of Syria at this point.
And Martin Reardon, as we mentioned before, it's not necessarily just about the groups themselves. There's not too much difference between, say, Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra and other al-Qaeda-linked groups. They come from the same fountain of ideology. Is it a mistake to maybe then focus only on Daesh and ignore some other groups that are very similar because they might just grow in strength while you're focusing on Daesh?
Well, that would be a mistake, but I don't think we're focusing only on Daesh or the Islamic State. There is a focus on al-Qaeda and both of those organizations' affiliates worldwide. But I think we go back to 2014 when the Islamic State came back down into Iraq and stormed Mosul and took over much of that country. Remember, 2014, they were a territory almost the size of the United Kingdom. That was a threat. It was a threat to the government of Iraq. It was a threat throughout that region. So it was the right response. Let's focus heavily on Islamic State now, diminish them as a military force so we can stabilize these governments, and at the same time, look at the other organizations, al-Qaeda and their affiliates around the world.
Martin, over the past couple of years, as their land, as their territory began to shrink, the conventional wisdom was they're going to be more dangerous, more erratic, more capable of inspiring lone wolf attacks, and maybe they'll lash out in places like Turkey more often. Now, thankfully, it hasn't happened the way a lot of people would have expected it to happen. Turkey has been particularly quiet over the past couple of years vis-a-vis Daesh attacks. Is that because there's just been better preventative measures taken by a country like Turkey, or that these guys just lack the capability and the organizational structures right now?
Well, I think we've seen with their past record, they certainly have the capability, the technical capability to carry out these attacks. It is, as you said, in large part due to law enforcement and intelligence actions, not only in Turkey, but throughout the Middle East, much of the Middle East, in Europe, in particular North America. Quite frankly, intelligence and law enforcement are better at intercepting these plans and thwarting them, breaking into these cells. But they're still a threat. There is, by some estimates, as many as 5,600 foreign fighters that have returned to 36 different countries, from Iraq and Syria. So they're home. Some of them have had enough fighting. They're not going to fight anymore. Other ones are still, they have the ideology. They still want to attack what they consider to be enemies of Islam. They're there. They're underground right now. But it's going to be a long-term fight.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, it's been fascinating talking to both of you, Martin Reardon and Mark Kimmett. Thanks for joining us once again on the Newsmakers. If you're living in the United Arab Emirates illegally and are afraid of getting in trouble, worry no more. The Gulf nation launched a 3-month visa amnesty for those who've stayed in the country longer than they should have. It includes everyone from workers to students, even some born to parents who had overstayed their visas. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines have been waived. So, what's in it for the UAE? Well, to help answer that question and more, we have Neha Vora from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She's an associate professor of anthropology at Lafayette College and specializes in the Indian diaspora and citizenship in Dubai. Neha, good to have you on the program. What's the true thinking, do you think, behind this amnesty in the UAE?
Okay, thanks for having me. I think it's sometimes we tend to think when we think about the Gulf states that these countries don't care about their workers, that they are very exploitative. But what we've seen over the last few years is that they have a symbiotic relationship with migrant workers, and they are working towards trying to improve labor conditions. So this is the third time that the UAE has had this kind of amnesty period where they are allowing people who have overstayed visas or are in the country illegally to come and get relief, to be allowed to either leave or to make themselves legal and get into the system in a way that they can be overseen, have legal employment. It's good for states because for several reasons. First of all, nobody wants migrant workers living in the kinds of conditions where they can be overexploited. It's not good for your residents, whether they're legal or whether they are migrants or citizens, for them to be living under conditions of exploitation. With all of the international pressure that's going on around the world, this is also a public relations issue. It's an issue that residents inside of the UAE care about. They don't like to live among such conditions of exploitation either. And it also helps the state to keep track of who's living within its borders. When you have amnesty, you have all of these people coming in who now you can fingerprint and you can get their biometrics and you can get their names, and you have a better sense of who's actually living within your borders.
Right. And I know, I mean, you have very many levels of migrant laborers and expats within these societies. There are those who, you know, have a really nice life as expats. There are those who are in the labor camps and so forth. What I want to understand from you is that, do they have good intentions to make it better now, while it's still exploitative and you still have these horrendous labor camps and you still have very many of them with very few rights? Is it just good intentions starting now, or have they actually improved the labor conditions over the past few years?
The sense that I get is that many of the Gulf states and the UAE as well, they are trying to create a system where things are more centralized. So the system that has been in place since the independence of the Gulf states, so the UAE gained independence in 1971, is something that scholars tend to call a kafala system, which you have an independent sponsor, or a kafil. So instead of you getting your visa through applying to the UAE government, you get a visa to work through either a citizen or a company. And what that creates is a system where the people that are responsible for the labor conditions are very diffuse, right? So and then you have more difficulty sometimes being able to ask for rights and get any kind of retribution if your rights are violated. So what the state has been doing is trying to centralize and trying to oversee a little bit more to make sure that workers' rights are more protected. And we've been seeing that happen more and more as labor reforms go into place, or reforms that are already in place are being overseen and implemented better. So I think that there is a good faith effort from within governments to try and improve labor conditions. The state is a very big, ambiguous thing. So to say that whether it has some kind of morality is a very difficult thing to say, right? I think there are actors within the state that are making good faith efforts.
Right. Okay. So you have the state, you have construction companies, you have all different players and protagonists and antagonists within this system. Is it mainly because of a kind of crisis of conscience, and as you say, PR issues, pressure from the outside, or is it something more existential, that they realize they need migrant workers a lot more than they thought they did in the past, and they can't be complacent about this thing because it's for the economy, it's for the sheer survival of the state?
I think that these countries definitely know that they need migrant workers. They know that they need migrants from at every single level, at the expert professional level, at the middle management level, and definitely at the more unskilled and semi-skilled level. And that's why they have these kinds of. But that's why I think you see this kind of amnesty scheme that's in place right now. And they work closely with the governments of the sending states in order to make sure that these things get implemented.
Is naturalization possible at some point soon? Are we going to be seeing someone whose parents are from Kerala, who was maybe born in Dubai, who becomes a citizen of the UAE, or is that still a long way away?
I'm not in the business of making predictions, but I think that is something that you're going to see a lot of resistance to from within the citizenry of the UAE. But naturalization is not something that doesn't happen. We see naturalization taking place in certain circumstances. So, for example, within the context of sports, the teams that play for things like the World Cup, those team members are naturalized, and at higher levels of business and people who have long-standing relationships with rulers, or who have, according to governments, contributed in some kind of large way to the government. They do have. It's not that naturalization doesn't occur. It's just very very unique.
Okay, interesting times in the Gulf for laborers and locals alike. Neha Vora, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Pyongyang hopes a summit could lead to the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. But has Seoul given up on the idea? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.